and welcome to the 6th meeting of the 2014 of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off mobile phones, as leaving them in flight mode or on silent will affect the broadcasting system. We have apologies from Rob Gibson, for whom I will be deputising, and I welcome Roderick Campbell, who is subbing for Rob. Agenda item 1, the Scottish Government's implementation of the Common Agricultural Policy and Scotland Rural Development Programme 2014-2020. Today the committee will hold its second evidence session with stakeholders on CAP and SRDP. This will be followed up with sessions with Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Owen Patterson, and the Cabinet Secretary at meetings later this month. First, I'd like to welcome our witnesses this morning, and I wonder if we could go round the table as a starting point and have everyone introduce themselves. Start with Andrew Midgley.
Hello, I'm Andrew Midgley. I'm Head of Policy at Scottish Land and Estates.
Hello, I'm Peter Cook. I'm an independent economist and a farmer.
Hello, I'm Bill Slee from the James Hutton Institute and a rural economist.
David McCracken, Professor of Agricultural Ecology and Head of SRUC's Hill and Mountain Research Centre.
Claudia, sorry. It's okay. Claudia Beamish, MSP for South Scotland and Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change.
Cara Hilton, MSP for Dunfermline.
Hello, I'm Pete Ritchie, Director of Nourish Scotland.
Hi, I'm James Graham, Chief Executive of SAOS, Scottish Agricultural Organisation Society.
Richard Lyle, Central Region, MSP.
Roderick Campbell, MSP for North East Fife.
Good morning, I'm Stuart Goodall from COMFOR. COMFOR represents the forestry and timber sector.
Alex Ferguson, the MSP for Galloway and West Dumfries, and may I, convener, once again draw attention to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests, which shows that I own land in Ayrshire, I do not farm it, and I don't benefit personally from CAP support. I probably should also say that I have just recently agreed to chair the United Kingdom review of the Voluntary Code of Conduct in the dairy industry.
I'm Vicky Swales, I'm Head of Land Use Policy for RSPB Scotland, but here today representing Scottish Environment Link.
Jim Hume, MSP for South Scotland, and also draw attention to the Register of Interest, where they have a farming interest.
Good morning, I'm Andy Tharn, the Ecology Officer at Scottish Borders Council, and I'm the Project Manager of the Scottish Borders Land Use Strategy Pilot.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nigel Dawn, MSP for Angus North and Mearns.
Good morning, I'm Angus MacDonald, MSP for Falkirk East.
I'm Graham Day, I'm the MSP for Angus South. I'm the Deputy Convener of the Committee, and for the purposes of today I'll be chairing the meeting in the absence of Rob Gibson. I want to open it up to questions. Can I say that we very much appreciate you coming along today and look forward to hearing your views, but in the interests of making progress, can I ask witnesses that if they don't have a specific view in relation to a particular question, that they shouldn't feel obliged to make a contribution on that particular question. So to start things off, can I ask witnesses, as stakeholders, what do you want from the CAP, and what should you get, given the level of budget Scotland has and the competing demands that Richard Lochhead has to contend with? I open that up to whoever wants to answer first. David McCracken.
I think it's worthwhile to point out that SRUC is probably somewhat in the same sort of situation as the Scottish Government. We provide services to the full range of agricultural businesses across Scotland. And we not only are providing research and advice to those businesses in terms of how to increase their agricultural production, but we're also providing research and advice to those businesses in terms of how to sort of mitigate their impacts on the environment or enhance their impacts on the environment. So, like the Scottish Government, you know, SRUC can find it difficult at times to try and draw a balance between all of these things. But, I mean, in short, I would say that we want to see a strong, productive agriculture in Scotland, but which is also taking into account and helping to enhance our environment, you know, in short.
Anyone else? Vicky?
Yeah, it's quite clear that over the years the objectives of the CAP have changed quite considerably, from supporting food production primarily to a much broader set of objectives which recognise wider environmental and social issues. We think the purpose of the CAP should be to help support and encourage a viable, competitive farming sector in Scotland, but also a sustainable farming sector in Scotland. And it very clearly has a role in delivering public goods. We believe these are public payments for public goods, and by that I mean things like helping us to have a countryside rich in wildlife, to help us manage our land, to store carbon, to meet our water quality objectives and deal with issues such as flooding. And the CAP very much has a primary purpose in relation to those, delivering those public goods.
Professor Slee.
Yes, I think a couple of years or so ago, Brian Pack and the Minister both used the term transformational change. And I think you can argue that the CAP, and particularly Pillar 2, should be helping generate transformational change towards a more economically vibrant, resilient and sustainable Scottish agriculture. And I think our fear is that it's tending not to do that, and it's tending to do more of the same rather than actually engender that transformational change that we should be seeking.
Stuart Goodall.
Thank you. The key message I'd like to get over is we want CAP and how it's implemented in Scotland to recognise that forestry is a key rural industry in Scotland. It's impacted on CAP both directly through a very limited amount of support under Pillar 2, but also by how CAP is delivered. I think it's extremely important that there's integration there, so that farmers are given the opportunity to benefit from engaging with forestry. And in terms of where we are at the moment with the current proposals, I think the key thing I'd highlight is that government has ambitions for forestry, and the element of budget that's there, £36 million, is the same level that's been made available since about 2007. And is completely insufficient in order to deliver government's own objectives for forestry. And we're also now seeing new challenges arising, such as pest and disease on some tree species, and the intention is to fund those out of the forestry pot. So the forestry pot is too small and is looking smaller by the year.
We'll come to Pillar 2 later in the meeting. We can deal specifically with these points. Andrew Midgley.
I think, as has already been said, the purpose of the CAP has evolved over time from the supporting of agricultural production to include the wider agenda of environment and rural development. The question that then comes to us is, how do we want to implement that? What is it that we want out of it? And I think one of the things that we're lacking is the vision of where we want to go. It relates to this point about transformational change. So we want to support our rural businesses and our agricultural businesses, but we also need to support the delivery of public goods and our wider rural businesses. What we need is a broader strategy that identifies where we want to go, and then we can use the CAP to help us get there. At the moment, what we tend to do is just continue to support what we have continued to support in the past. And I think we have a general agenda that we know we want to support agricultural businesses and the delivery for environmental purposes and wider rural development, but we don't necessarily have the right mechanisms to deliver at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you. Peter Cook.
The question, I think, should be, do we want the CAP? Surely it's just public money. There's lots of good uses for public money. It's not going to disappear. We should use it as well as we can. There are a lot of very good things, like the environment and carbon and water and things we can do to improve our competitiveness. But the ultimate benefit for a sustainable, competitive Scottish industry must be that we're able to do without it, or to be able to do without less of it. And in these debates, nobody ever usually says that. And so part of the aim of spending that money should be to give ourselves an industry that in the long term doesn't need so much of it. And actually, I think you'd find farmers would support that.
Okay, thank you for that. Pete Ritchie.
Yeah, Nourish would like to see a transformational change, farming for public goods, as Vicky said, and particularly recognition that food and farming have a major role to play in mitigating and adapting to climate change. That needs to be central to the way we implement the CAP in Scotland. And we need to send a very clear message that this isn't about production or environmental goods. We need to get away from this idea that there's a sort of real farming, which is about production, and then there's sort of green stuff that we have to sort of fit in somewhere. So we need to change that rhetoric. And most of all, I think Nourish wants to see farming for public health. You know, we have a complete disconnect between how we farm in Scotland and what we eat. And we need to narrow that gap, and that should be a primary purpose of this next round of the CAP, that we look at measures, particularly through Pillar 2, since that's where we have to end up squeezing these things in, to make our farming system, our food systems, healthier for people as well as for the environment.
Okay, thanks, James Graham.
Yeah, we would like to see a programme really that drives and stimulates change, adaptation and innovation in the industry. And again, I would echo the point really that perhaps the emphasis of CAP at the moment appears to be supporting the sustaining what has been and what is ongoing at the moment. And of course, we're very much concerned with utilising the full potential of cooperation amongst farmers and collaboration in food and drink supply chains to achieve all of economic benefit, environmental benefit and social benefit. And it's proven it can do that. But we do need to see an SRDP that supports that and actually stimulates momentum for change.
Okay, thank you. Nigel Dawn has a point.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just wondering, in light of all those comments, whether folk, and I realise that the farming community was to some extent represented last week, or to a greater extent represented last week, whether our witnesses have any comment on whether or not there has been enough transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, whether more should be in the SRDP, and in a very separate but connected issue, how quickly we should be moving from the current historical payments of Pillar 1 to an area basis, which to some extent people have suggested will put more up the hill into the less favoured areas. I'm wondering whether that's a discussion that people could take forward, please.
Vicky Swales.
Yeah. Scottish Environment Link pressed for the full 15% transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. We are in the situation we are where we didn't get a better deal from Europe, but the Scottish Government had an opportunity to boost funding for Pillar 2 to help deliver some of this transformational change. We didn't do that, and therefore we've effectively sacrificed, if I can put it like that, about £200 million that could have gone into the new SRDP and been spent on some really useful measures. So that is a big problem in itself. I mean, overall, in the longer term, I think we should definitely be moving more money into Pillar 2 as CAP is reformed. The issue in Pillar 1 in terms of whether the money will go up the hill or not is debatable, given the proposals on the table at the moment. Yes, there will be redistribution. Yes, in broad terms, it will move from intensive to extensive areas. But at the current proposed rates of 20 to 25 euros per hectare for the more marginal ground, the rough grazing, I think that's problematic for supporting our most economically disadvantaged but often most environmentally important farms. And I think in terms of the transition time, we do need to move quite quickly. This has been signalled for a long time. We've known we've had to move from historic. Scottish Government took the decision to stick with the historic payment system last time round. Farmers have known this is coming, and to delay it further through to 2019, I think, is just putting off change that absolutely needs to happen. But we do need to get a fairer redistribution of the support we have in Pillar 1 to actually support the most economically but environmentally important farms.
Okay, Andrew Midgley.
Thank you. As an organisation, Scottish Land and Estates would support transfer of funds to Pillar 2. We want to see a very strong rural development programme. We're interested in rural development in the widest sense. In this particular instance, however, we believe that context is everything. The changes that are taking place in Pillar 1 are, we believe, going to have a fairly wide-ranging impact that we have to be cautious about. So we were supportive of the 9.5% transfer, but it was on the proviso that as soon as the implications of the impact of what's going on in Pillar 1 are more fully understood, once we know how much land's coming in and the impact on businesses, and that should become clearer from the first year of the scheme, because we'll be able to work things out from there, then we should revisit that at the earliest opportunity, and the Scottish Government will have the opportunity to increase that rate come 2017. So I think our position was to support the government because of the context of the changes in Pillar 1. In terms of transition, we again are advocating the proposed route towards 2019 for the purposes of allowing businesses to change. Vicky's point that people have known that this is happening for a long time is perfectly valid, but whether or not they've known it's coming for a long time doesn't necessarily mean that they have actually prepared, and so we need to change and move in Pillar 1 in a way that isn't so drastic that it does have a very detrimental impact on businesses.
Angus MacDonald, do you want to come in with a point?
Well, I was going to pick up on Vicky Swale's point with regard to rough grazing. I don't know if it might be best if I come in after.
I think we can come and cover that in a second, if that's okay, if we may. David McCracken?
Just, I will answer your question. Just to pick up on a point, I think it was Andrew that said earlier on about the need for a broader strategy. I think it's worthwhile, in order to achieve any vision for the CAP, I think it's worthwhile remembering and giving them their due that at the start of this whole process, DG Agriculture and DG Environment did get together, and what they were wanting to try and achieve would, I would suggest, have achieved that broader strategy. It hasn't for a whole variety of reasons. We're not going to go back into that. So we are where we are. With regard to your question about transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, then from SRUC's perspective, then we are content with that level of transfer, but would like to actually, as I think again Andrew had mentioned, see that being reviewed, particularly once we get the chance next in 2016. But I think it's particularly important to recognise that we are in a very complicated situation, and there are strong interlinkages between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and decisions that are made within any one of those pillars can actually influence what else happens within each of those. And also, decisions that's made within Pillar 1, for example, with regard to greening, which I'm sure we'll come on to, has a strong interlinkage with what decisions with regard to Pillar 2, with regard to agri-environment. And the additional complication is the fact that because of those interlinkages, other than the transfer, we don't yet have a number of spikes pinned into the ground, known points that we can then make an informed decision about what would be the best to do with some of these other sort of aspects. So that does complicate the whole thing. But as I said, SRUC was happy with the 9.5%, and like Scottish Land and Estates, SRUC's position is they want to see that transition happening through to 2018-19, again to give businesses the chance to actually adapt.
I think from a research perspective, we would see maximising the transfer to be a good thing. Clearly there is an issue over flattening and what it will do, and there's some uncertainty about that. But we've got a very small Pillar 2, and de facto, a very significant part of it, ELFAS, operates rather like a direct payment and really could almost be seen to belong to Pillar 1. If you take that out of Pillar 2, what's left is very small indeed to achieve the transformational change, and therefore any increase in that would be a good thing.
Pete Ritchie.
If we've got objectives, we want to change something, then it makes sense to use a sharper instrument, which is Pillar 2, to achieve that change, rather than rely on a very blunt instrument of Pillar 1, which has no public good connection to the money we're spending. So maximising the modulation made complete sense to Nourish. We didn't really understand why you wouldn't do that, because you can achieve the public goods objectives better if you move the money into Pillar 2. And in terms of pace of change, Nourish would support a change as soon as possible. If it's the right thing to change, why not change? And other changes we make, like we run a restaurant business, when VAT went up, it went up, and we had to cope with it. We had to deal with it, and I think businesses will deal with it. Obviously, some businesses would like the present arrangements to go on for longer, but if it's the right thing to do, why not do it now?
It's an interesting point, given that VAT increases are sometimes sprung on businesses on the back of a budget, whereas agricultural businesses have known for many years much of what was coming. Jim Hume, do you want to tackle the issue of grazing?
Picking up on Vicky Swales and really points that were made last week by the Crofters and the NFUS regarding the implementation of the basic payment of an area base, specifically regarding the rough grazing. Large part of Scotland is classified as RGR, rough grazing. Last week we heard that it would, the single payment, which would be something like 20 to 25 euros per hectare, I believe, you'd only have to have one sheep for every 3 hectares, would lead to an overpayment for very scarcely farmed, very inactive areas, and an underpayment for very active areas. and they even quoted as saying it would lead to land abandonment and decimation of productive areas. I just wondered what the panel's view was on that particular point.
Vicky Swales.
Yeah, if I may come back to that, since I raised the issue of rough grazing. We are quite concerned, and we're concerned from an environmental perspective, because if you look at the rough grazing area, what we know is that large proportions of that land are designated sites, Natura sites under EU legislation, the Birds and Habitats Directive. There's a strong coincidence between the two, and that is by dint of the farming systems that operate there, which are in many cases very, very extensive. So there's a figure being talked about for active farming of 0.05 livestock units per hectare. We know there's about 750,000 hectares of land which is designated, which is stocked below that rate, somewhere around 0.02, 0.03. Now that may not sound to some people like active farming, but it is. It's just very extensive, and it's delivering a huge amount of environmental benefit. So there are big concerns about the viability of the farm businesses in those areas, which already struggle, which get a poor deal from Pillar 1, and actually arguably get a poor deal from ELFAS as well, because of the way the scheme is constructed, with the money going to the better land within the LFA rather than the poorer quality land. So we really think we need to look at this quite seriously from an environmental perspective, never mind an economic and social perspective, and the impacts on those rural communities if farmers and crofters do just decide to give up and see that it's not worth their while anymore.
Thank you. Davy McCracken.
Yes, I mean, as we'll highlight in our Pillar 1 consultation, which was not yet finalised, then SRUC recognises that potential disparity, and from an economic point of view, would be suggesting, pushing that the rough grazing payment is actually split into two separate levels. But in addition, we also recognise the points that Vicky has made there about the wider public benefit arising from some of those less intensively or more extensively stocked grazing systems, and SRUC has been integral over the last sort of 20 years in highlighting the fate of those high nature value farming systems, both in Scotland and all over Europe, and a large proportion of what we have in Scotland that would fall under that sort of category. And I believe you also discussed last week the extra potential, or the potential to have some additional coupled payment directed to sheep systems, and certainly we would be while we're supporting the change in actual payment from a rough grazing payment perspective, we would be supportive of and strongly encouraging looking closely at that additional coupling mechanism to see how and why and if it could be actually utilised to actually help with some of the economic disadvantage in some of these areas.
McDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, just picking up on David McCracken's point and the earlier point from Vicky Swales. It was certainly mentioned last week that it is claimed that we could be seeing land abandonment, rural depopulation, and a significant reduction in the number of store stock coming out of the northwest of Scotland and the islands. Now, Johnny Hall came up with a solution, as you've alluded to, which helpfully suggested that although there would be a reduction in the basic payment of 15 euros per hectare, but then there would be a payment applied per ewe on that same ground of about 30 euros. This was just his figures, which would take you into the region of 45 euros per hectare for the hill ground that has 1 ewe per hectare on it. So, and also where there's more extensive systems, the NFGS were proposing that where there's a ewe per 5 hectares, you'd get 20 to 21 euros per hectare. So it's good to hear that you're kind of welcoming that suggestion. I'd be interested to know if any other panel members have a view on it.
Can I come Andrew Midgley first?
I'm afraid I'd probably add a note of caution. There is an issue. The question is then how you deal with it. And there's a really difficult balancing act to be performed here, because one way that you can respond is to say, okay, there's a problem here, therefore what we need to do is make the whole system more complicated. We need to create more regions. We have to have differentiated coupled payments between sectors. And suddenly the landscape gets more and more and more complicated. The principle, I think, should probably be one of simplicity, if at all possible. And what we're in danger of doing is trying to come up with the solutions for everyone. There are going to be changes. We have to accept that. You know, that will be the consequence of the changing nature of farm support. The question is, can we implement it in a way which finds the right balance? And there are tools in the box, and we're not entirely sure yet exactly how this will pan out, because the figures that we're talking about are related to the amount of land that might come in, and that's not entirely clear. And that will be related to the eligibility criteria that are applied, and we're talking about minimum stocking requirements, about being an active farmer. All of those things will have an impact on the sorts of figures that we're talking about. And we have to remember that the base payment would potentially be enhanced in other ways as well, in terms of coupled payments. So, you know, I guess my note of caution is, let's try and remember simplicity. Otherwise, we're going to tie ourselves up in knots.
Thank you for that, Peter Cook.
I'm really just going to say the same thing. I mean, what you described as a nightmare. There'll be winners and losers, and we'll all be sitting here saying, well, actually, we did that out of good intentions. Of course, out of all good intentions. And we created another bunch of winners and losers, and now we're going to have to change it again. It's a great thing about the simplicity that Andrew talked about there. Folk can at least plan. The problem in North West Highlands, all the studies that we've ever been involved in, is really a big structural thing. They're not the folk to gather the sheep. You know, it's not just about the price of lambs. It's a much bigger thing. If you want to answer the issues there, then I think it's a different set of things you need to look at. You know, to tinker a wee bit, put a little bit of this and a little bit of that, will maybe have a tiny effect, but it'll just complicate the thing, and nobody will know where they stand. You know, strategically for Scotland, you lose all the sheep from the North West Highlands. If the rest of the sheep in Scotland produced 4% more lambs, it would replace them all. So strategically, it's not that important. Very important culturally there, of course. So the answer for that area is Pillar 2. To maintain the systems there through Pillar 2 that have something to do with culture and maintaining the environment and the look of the place. That's the public benefit. You know, I think that's the way to do it. Don't try and tinker around with this Pillar 1 area. That's my view anyway.
Thank you for that. Vicky Swales.
I just wanted to come back on that. I identified a problem in terms of needing to retain farming in those areas for environmental reasons as well as social and economic. We wouldn't advocate necessarily a return to coupled payments. That's just going backwards. That's turning the clock back. And I also agree with Andrew that creating complicated things where we start to split regions and give differential payment rates is neither the solution either. I mean, I think what we're saying is we need to get the basic payment right in a simple form, which gives an uplift to those farms. Now, okay, so you may overcompensate some farms, but you may also ensure that you retain the farming in the places that you want to. But I'd also agree with Peter that if you also want to help these regions, the best way to do it is through Pillar 2, is through helping businesses diversify, see what other opportunities there are, and help rural communities more widely. So I wouldn't necessarily support the NFU solution to this problem, which is, just let's start throwing much more Pillar 1 subsidy in the form of coupled payments to it. I don't think that's the answer at all.
Thank you. I don't propose to give an official view from the land use strategy pilot, because that wouldn't really be appropriate, because we're engaging with a wide range of stakeholders, many of whom are represented here today, and there's obviously a variety of views on the SRDP and CAP. But perhaps there's an opportunity to reflect on what we've learnt so far under the pilot process, which is about halfway through, where we're considering an ecosystem approach, adopting the land use strategy principles, so that reflects on how ecosystems functions and the services that the land provides, and also engaging people in decision making. And as part of that, we've engaged with a range of stakeholders, and part of the feedback we've received so far has been to highlight the role of rough grazing and how that, in terms of public goods, how that can help provide public goods in terms of carbon sequestration. So we've been asked to consider that further as part of our pilot process. So I thought it would be important to feed that in.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll move on now to the issue of greening measures and how these should be implemented. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. It seems to move quite seamlessly onto that. I'd like to ask a specific question about the greening measures, and also a broader question about Pillar 1 and how that can really continue to integrate production and environmental issues into a forward-looking transformational way forward. So could I ask how, in relation to our climate and geographical challenges that we have here in Scotland, are the panel members reasonably content with how the greening measures are likely to be implemented, and if not, what other views are there about that? And as I say, we've heard about transformational change. We've also heard this morning about how, if I'm not putting the wrong words in people's mouths, how production, it should not be production or the environment. And my view is, for what it's worth, that Pillar 1 should have an integrated production and environmental system. And there are a lot of very good examples of farms that work in a way that involves adaptation to climate change and climate change monitoring and biodiversity issues and water issues. So do the panel have any views more broadly on the integration of production and environment within Pillar 1, but also very specifically the challenges for the 3 measures of greening?
Davy McCracken.
Yes, just to say, and I think I've possibly said before at this panel, hold my hand up in terms of I was a member of a team back in 2007, I think it was, who actually suggested some of the aspects that we've now got sitting within the sort of the greening programme, the ecological focus areas, and the diversification of crop measures. But I think it's important from a Scottish perspective to highlight that the diversification of crop measure was not a measure that we ever suggested or intended should be applied at a wide EU, mandatory at a wider EU level. And so that would be the main one of the 3 measures that we would certainly agree is not necessarily very relevant to Scotland. The way it has been framed at a European level means it's highly unlikely to achieve very much from an environmental perspective or a biodiversity perspective. So we would be strongly supportive of finding ways to actually implement that particular aspect of the measure without having major impacts on, the farm businesses that actually have to do that. With regard to the other 2, then similar sort of issues apply in terms of the ecological focus areas as is currently proposed from a European level. Is not going the full way down the line in terms of getting to a point where we would say if they were applied that they would actually have environmental or sort of biodiversity benefits. And so it comes back to one of the points I made earlier. It all comes down to how exactly, what decisions are actually made within now within the Scottish Government's gift in terms of which aspects, which elements, habitats, features, whatever, call them what you will, to actually include within the sort of greening measure, and also from the permanent grassland point of view, how what would be the word, rigorous or detailed they actually make the implementation of that. So it's because the spikes are not there yet, it's difficult to actually answer your question in full. And just remind me what your more specific question was. you know, how integrated should agriculture and environment be? Well, I mean, in order to address our biodiversity, water quality and climate change issues that we have, you know, agriculture has a key role to play, not a role to play, has a key role to play. So they have to be integrated looking ahead into the future, not just from the point of view of actually addressing those environmental issues, but also to ensure that, you know, our farming systems can remain productive while addressing those sort of farming issues, because if we don't address those issues, it will come back and bite our farming systems on the backside, if I could say so, in the future.
Okay, thank you. Vicky Swales.
I think there's sometimes a view that Scottish farming systems are already quite green and we don't need to worry too much, but unfortunately that isn't the case, and we know that we're facing declines in farmland biodiversity, we have water quality, diffuse pollution problems, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and we also need to think about how we use our land to deal with flood risk management, for example. And the Scottish Government has set some ambitious targets in relation to those things, very laudable targets, and if we're to meet them, and if we're serious about meeting them, then we need to use all of the CAP and all of the funding at our disposal to help us do that. So we definitely need to look at both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 to help us achieve those targets. Greening, in some respects, is a significant step in relation to CAP reform. In others, it's perhaps a bit disappointing. From an environmental perspective, it didn't go as far as we would have liked. But it is significant, it's there, it's in Pillar 1, and it will represent an amount of money around about £130 million per annum. That's almost 4 times the agri-environment budget. It's incumbent on us to use that money wisely and to make it deliver some real environmental benefit. Now, the rules that have been handed down from the EU are not entirely helpful. They've done what the CAP does, tried to come up with a common set of rules that apply across Europe to address certain problems. And of course they don't. There are peculiarities, differences in different places that mean those rules don't always fit very well. To us, the best way to deal with this is to go down the equivalence route and to introduce a national certification scheme. If you do that, you have more options at your disposal. You can tailor what's required from farmers to the Scottish situation much better. So a mix of using the basic 3 measures, the crop diversification, the permanent grassland measures and the ecological focus areas, but the additional options which equivalence gives you, I think is the way to go. There are discussions ongoing with Scottish Government at the moment, and Link is party to those discussions. We are hopeful that something good will come out of it. However, we do hit the barrier of saying, well, the Rural Payments and Inspections Directorate isn't going to like this or doesn't like this when we sit in these meetings. There are complications, it's too difficult to administer, we can't inspect that, we can't verify that. Some of those concerns, I believe, are legitimate, but some of it, I think, is an unwillingness, actually, to really look seriously at the scope of these measures and to see how we can implement them. If the will is there, we can do it. If the will isn't there, we won't do it. And greening will be little more than greenwash if we're not careful.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to bring Rod Campbell in here. I think Rod Campbell's got an example that's important to his constituency of practical difficulties.
Last week we heard evidence from the soft fruit growers of the difficulties that the requirements of fruit and vegetable scheme under CAP and the greening requirements under Pillar 1 made it difficult to manage the productive area of a fruit farm. And what was being suggested, I think, last week would be that a better approach would be to continue to operate intensively in some areas, but in other areas to be very green. So to kind of to split it out. I don't know whether those concerns are legitimate and whether the proposed solution which was being offered of splitting it out would actually work. I don't know whether the panel's got a view on that.
Andrew Midgley.
Hey, I do. I'll come back to it. Can I start, first of all, with Claudia's questions, then I'll address the issue specifically on that. I'll take the broader question first, which is about the degree of integration and then talk about greening. So the degree of integration, there has been a debate for quite a long time, which is about where is the best place to deliver public goods. And the natural consequence of that debate was that you should transfer more money from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. That debate was lost at the European level, and hence the delivery of public goods stayed within Pillar 1. The consequence is what we're left with, which is greening, which has all the problems. So the answer to your question is probably actually integration, delivery for the environment is probably best through Pillar 2. It can be targeted, it can be delivered in a specific way to deliver an outcome that you want. Because if you're trying to deliver the common policy and you set out very generic greening proposals for the whole of the European Union, we end up in the problem where they don't apply everywhere and some potentially don't deliver very much in particular places. So I think my argument is actually that the logic still holds that Pillar 2 is the best place to deliver for the environment. We are where we are, though, and we have a set of greening requirements that we have to deliver. So Scottish Land and Estates takes the position so coherent with my previous comments about simplicity, that given that we have to implement it, we basically should do the standard measures that Europe has given us, and that we should try and use some of the flexibility that is available. And this brings us on to the issue about the problems for particular people. There are potentially some measures within the regulations that might help. So there's the suggestion that that the Scottish Government might be able to accept EFA requirements at a regional level, or that people could work collectively. And that has consequences in that the individual might not necessarily have to do all the EFA on their particular holding. They might be able to do 50% of it. So there's potential mitigation to the concerns in those sorts of sectors. So it might be that we already have the tools in the box to help deal with that. It's a question about whether or not we choose to take them up. Scottish Land and Estates, I think, is minded to support at least the consideration of those tools in addition to just the straight greening measures, because of the potential for people to be able to work together to deliver enhanced environmental benefits within the confines of what we have to do within Pillar 1. As far as equivalence goes, there are potential wins on equivalence. We could come up with things that might work, but we come back to the simplicity thing, and I think we're still open-minded, but in the short term we suggest that we actually just get on with the 3 measures as handed down by Europe, because people need to be planning what they're doing fairly soon, and so they need to have some certainty, whereas the certification approach through equivalence might take time and so on. But we're not necessarily completely close to that idea.
Pete Ritchie.
Just to say, Nourish would completely support Vicky's argument. We should be going for an equivalence approach, and we should be developing our own approach to this. I know it will be difficult, but we do have sort of world-leading science on this. We know a lot about environment, biodiversity, climate change. We know about developing our measures. As a very simple example, Nourish is very keen to support agroforestry measures, both on pastoral land but also on arable land, which has all sorts of benefits and could be very much supported through the SRDP and through the CAP generally, through the greening measures. We need to grow more legumes in Scotland. We need to grow more homegrown protein, and not be reliant on importing soya from Latin America. So we need to move that way. And we also need to pay attention to organic production, which is an obvious thing that other countries are moving towards very quickly in Europe. France is doubling its area of organic production, aiming to double its consumption of organic food. It's one of our key export markets. So we're not really looking at that as something we could lead on. But overall, what Nourish would say is that the advisory service, which is a sort of key part of the Pillar 2 proposals, has a really important part to play in this change. If we want to be moving towards a more integrated approach of environment and production, the advisory service is one of our key tools that we can use in that process. And that has to have a very clear mission statement. There's lots of other ways of promoting productivity. There's lots of market measures that will promote productivity. You get paid if you produce more. What the advisory service needs to do is to help farmers and land managers integrate environment and production creatively over the next few years. And that's where we need to be putting the transformative change in.
David McCracken.
Just 2 quick comments and then coming back to Roderick's question. The discussion and debate that we're having here about greening echoes the discussion and debate we're having about greening all over Europe. To my mind, it also throws out a bigger generic sort of issue, Part of the discussion and debate we're having about greening is the fact that we seem to have forgotten what the overall aims and desired outcomes were from the sort of greening proposals. And a lot of the discussion is about how do we actually implement it in a way that is less sort of constraining on farmers, etc. But I would suggest that that same discussion, or the same indication of forgetting what the overall sort of desired outcomes, applies across the board, across the discussions we're having about CAP. And a lot of the focus is not on what do you want Pillar 1 or Pillar 2 to actually achieve. It's actually how do you go about sort of making sure our farmers remain competitive. And I think that is a danger, you know, because we'll be then constraining ourselves into a structure for the next 5-6 years at least, if not the full 7. I sit in the same meetings as Vicky does in terms of greening, and in a variety of other meetings where her comment about ARPID and accepting, like Vicky, their concerns about the sort of the verification process, depending on what aspects you bring into the sort of greening process. But as I've also said in some of those other meetings, I think it's very important to actually have a longer view as to what benefit, not just from an environmental perspective, would be bringing in, for example, landscape features into the ecological focus areas, but then actually mapping and knowing where those is would be a wonderful resource to actually have in order to, I think it was Andrew said, you know, decide in the future where is the best place to deliver public goods. If we have knowledge of what's in each field and the landscape context within which they sit, that's a great resource to my mind that could be used for the future. And then finally, with regard to Roderick's point, and I'm not sure, Roderick, whether you were suggesting that horticulture situations were suggesting that with regard to the greening requirements, they actually just do what they're doing and leave someone else somewhere else in the region to actually produce the greening requirements. If that was what you were suggesting, then I think there would be a real danger in that.
No, I wasn't suggesting that. I was suggesting kind of division of the land that they actually have.
Yes, well, that comes back to, it's already been addressed earlier on by a number of people who said we should be using the equivalence approach to actually help ensure that those farmers can meet those requirements, because it's, as I said earlier, the crop diversification one in particular is not going to be here or there either way in terms of any additional environmental benefits sort of really gained from it.
So, to broaden this out a little bit, should we not be introducing a tangible measure of carbon footprint reduction into the CAP payment system, perhaps utilising the SAC Consulting Agricultural Resource Efficiency Calculator, and either reward or penalise farmers according to the progress they make over a measured period? If you look at the intensive fruit and vegetable scheme, it requires anyone benefiting from it to make year-on-year environmental improvements. And we heard last week from William Houston from Angus Growers that as suppliers to one particular supermarket chain, they've signed up to that chain's 2020 target, which demands a 20% reduction in emissions by 2020. Don't we need to challenge broader agriculture to better engage in the overall green agenda that we're pretty much asking every other aspect of Scottish society to engage with? Bill Swee.
Yes, I do think we need to look to agriculture to do more in terms of what it can do with respect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I think some progress has been made, but the Commission hasn't been moving terribly fast on this to date. And I think the research community has moved forward, and I think we need to move towards essentially farm-level greenhouse gas budgeting. And I think we could, if we had a different Pillar 2, deliver significant support to farmers to move towards those ends. The latest consultation document on Pillar 2 wasn't terribly revealing as to exactly what kind of measures were being invoked. We know that some farmers have already responded, and I think, as Claudia said earlier, there's some fantastic examples out there of farmers who have, I could name Roger Paulson, for example, in Aberdeenshire, who has what he thinks is a greenhouse gas neutral farm now. And that has been thought through and planned and is a fantastic example. But there are a lot of other farms that emit a lot of greenhouse gases, and there is no real incentive to reduce those emissions at the moment. Pillar 2 could add quite a lot, but it's not there at the moment.
Vicky Swales.
Yeah, I mean, just finishing on that point, I mean, I think there is an awful lot that could be done to help farmers reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, which would clearly be of benefit to the business. I was at a meeting recently which was giving some results from the Farming for a Better Climate initiative. There was an example there of a dairy farm business which had saved £30,000 by reducing his energy usage and his fertiliser usage, etc. Win-win. I mean, you know, why wouldn't you be doing that as a farmer? Okay, he needed some help, he needed some information, he needed some advice to be able to work out how to do that. That's what we should be investing in. We shouldn't necessarily be paying farmers directly for reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. There's private benefit in this as well as public good. And I just wanted to come back to the more general point and the point about certain types of producers being affected by greening and other things. I mean, Link was in a meeting with the Cabinet Secretary where he said he wanted to see every farmer acting in a greener way than before as a result of these reforms. We were greatly heartened by that, and we want to hold him to that. Every farm and every area of land has the potential to be farmed in an environmentally sensitive way, to deliver environmental benefits, and potentially to reduce costs to the business as well, because they're not throwing away fertilisers and pesticides unwittingly. So we don't support any notion of separating out production on the one hand and environment on the other and think you can just do some things in a little bit of Scotland and that will be all right. Nature doesn't work like that. The environment doesn't work like that. And wearing my RSPB hat, we have direct experience of running a commercial arable farm in Cambridgeshire, where we've not only increased the yields from that farm in terms of the wheat, etc., that we produce, we've also doubled the farmland bird yield, as it were, by doing some very, very simple, cost-effective measures that put habitat back into the farm, but also allow the farmer to continue commercially. There are lots of solutions out there, but farmers need to know that and need the help to move to that more sustainable basis for their farming systems.
And finally, on this point, Andrew Midgley.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree that there is a very important move that needs to be made, and the organisations like Scottish Land Estates are keen that we do everything we can to help the industry move in that direction. We're part of a whole range of initiatives to try and do that. Admittedly, progress is slow, and there are examples where people flag up the win-win sort of scenario, and you wonder why this hasn't been pursued, and so you get into the realms of advice, of support in helping to do that. I think as an organisation we would steer clear of the big stick, because it's not a good motivator. If you are starting to link the delivery of your direct farm support with reduction in carbon emissions, you get into a very complicated area that would be difficult to administer, and potentially you move away from level playing field, because it depends, you know, what other countries are doing in the rest of Europe as well. So there's a set of issues there that actually might not help really get people on side and move in the right direction. I think it really could be great, where we see great opportunity potentially, is in the much better valuation of the public benefit, so that the person running the farm business can see that there is benefit for them, and we need to get much better at highlighting that benefit, so that it's a pure business decision rather than government telling you. It's the market that's telling you that actually this is the good way to go.
There will come a point where if the progress isn't being made, something will have to be done, presumably. Peter Cook, very briefly, you wanted to come in.
Sorry, I didn't want to throw a cat amongst the pigeons, but and it is just common sense. Reducing energy use, for sure, is what it kind of comes down to: energy use per unit of output. But it is a partial thing, and to design an entire policy around carbon is very scary. I mean, if you review the SRDP as it is written now, you certainly would not support hill sheep, because the amount of carbon required to produce a kilo of hill sheep is phenomenal. What you'd support is pigs, intensive soft fruit, because they look intensive in terms of use of energy, but the amount of energy used per unit of output is tiny. You certainly wouldn't support organic, because the amount of energy used per unit of output is phenomenal, because instead of using a very small amount of chemical to control weeds, you're running up and down your tractor all day. These are horrifying truths, and I'm not very sure you would really want to design your policy around that. And of course, carbon is only one reason why you know, you would design a system. So I would just be careful. But it is interesting to review the SRDP as it stands now on that basis.
Yeah, I must allow Peter Ritchie to come in on there. He's bursting.
Thank you very much for this. Slurs on organic. Last year's SRUC Conference on Sustainable Intensification, the world record wheat yield in Lincolnshire, 13 tonnes a hectare, had been measured in terms of greenhouse gas intensity per kilo of wheat. And the researcher said it was very interesting because this was the best on our bar chart. But one farm we hadn't looked at was next door, which is an organic farm. And yes, the yields were low, but actually the wheat yields per kilo of greenhouse gas emissions were lower than the world record farm. And I said, did he count the carbon sequestration? He said, no. Carbon sequestration on organic systems across the meta-analysis of studies is about 28% above non-organic systems. So I just refute your statement about greenhouse gas emissions and organic farming.
Show you some more numbers then. But it's worth a question. The question needs to be asked, and it never is. We assume these things are built into our feeling of it must be good. We need to question these things. This is public money.
A lot of other questions to cover as well. Richard Lyle's going to deal with the issue of capping.
Yeah, yes, Convener, and I've sat intensely, and I'm very impressed with the witnesses we have this morning. I also am very impressed with the work that farmers do in Scotland. But the problem is it's going to become harder because at the end of the day, the money is going to go down, the jam will need to be spread. What do we do? How do we look at this, and how do we improve the way that we are producing our food to a better degree, whether it's organic or whether it's through traditional methods, in order to ensure that we can get the best from our farmers and from the best from this pot of money that is being reduced and reduced by another government in one way. Should we set targets, and should we really be looking at, is there a case for any other additional capping of payments? I think someone said earlier we should be setting targets in order to improve what people are doing. So should everyone be set a target? As I say, there will be winners, there will be losers, and I'm sure the losers won't be too happy. But in order to ensure that everybody is getting a fair crack of the whip and everybody is working, putting their grindstone to the wheel, basically to ensure we do produce the best food in the world. And let's be honest, it is the best food in the world that's produced in Scotland. And I think every farmer and every grower does a lot of good. But should we be setting additional capping of the payments in order to ensure that everybody is doing their best?
I think we took evidence last week from the NFUS that suggested that very, very few examples of €150,000 would actually exist in Scotland for capping purposes. Can somebody kind of take that into answering the question? Pete Ritchie.
Yeah, I think the Scottish Government has been remarkably coy about how many people are getting those big payments, why they're getting those big payments, and what the money would be available to Pillar 2 if you cap those payments at €150,000, as, for example, Northern Ireland has done, where there are only 4 or 5 farmers in that band. We haven't had that information being given out as part of the planning on the different ways the money could move around. And on our estimates, based on the figures we do have, around €20 million a year could be moved into Pillar 2. Not a huge amount, but actually, given that there's not much in Pillar 2 at the moment, every little helps if you cap those payments at €150,000 at 100%. And NERS's view is simply that the larger businesses that are getting those sorts of payments shouldn't simply need that amount of public money without any obligations or requirement to deliver public goods or requirement even to submit accounts to keep their businesses going. If by now they can't have a viable business with that level of public subsidy, then they're not as efficient, as productive as sometimes the NFU likes to make out that businesses are. So we really need to question whether any business needs that level of continuing subsidy.
Andrew Midgley.
Thank you. So I think the Scottish Government did release some figures. Well, they came to the Future CAP Stakeholders Group in 2012 when they did some analysis as the debate was going through the European Parliament. And they, I think, calculated that 60 people, approximately 60 people, would be affected. But those figures are based on the previous level of payment rather than the future payment, because it's extremely difficult to work out how many people will be affected, because we still don't know what the base payment will be, because it's related to all the other decisions that we have to make about coupling and so on. So you're right, there isn't a very clear picture, but it's in that order. I think we would caution and suggest that there shouldn't be capping. The move to, as you suggest, a sort of a fairer system is happening. This is a move to area payments. So the question about capping is, would you cap initially, because the returns from capping would decrease over time as the move to area payments takes place. So it's basically for a few years would you impose capping. Our position is that we shouldn't. And I think the reason we take that position is that of those people that would be receiving that much support, they are probably going to be some of the biggest producers. They're big businesses. And then you get into the sort of the law of sort of unintended consequences. I can understand the rationale for thinking this is a lot of public money going to this one business, but if you put yourself in the position of that business, what will they do, and how will they think about it, and how will they react? So if at the moment they're operating with a certain sort of margin, and included in their calculation is the support that they receive from the government, and then suddenly that support is reduced a lot, then suddenly you're pushing their business into having to make some decisions about how they reduce costs or how they change that business. And that then ultimately comes into an impact on the supply chain or an impact on people's jobs, because they employ people. And ultimately, that's the law of unintended consequences. In order to try and think, actually, this doesn't look fair, and hit one person, you actually affect someone else. And so I think bearing in mind that we're moving to an area-based system over time, and that problem will be solved by the end of the period, if you like, that there will still be large payments going to individuals, because we do have people with large enterprises, but short term, we don't necessarily want to create other problems.
Okay, thank you. We need to make progress. So Davy McCracken will be the last contributor on this.
All I wanted to say was, I'm sure SRUC doesn't, I'm not saying we don't have a view, but unfortunately, just checking my notes up, we haven't formed a view on that as yet, and I assume that's because some of my economic colleagues are actually looking into, exactly the detail of what level of individuals and what level of funding would be affected. So,
thank you for that. I think we'll move on now to look at new entrants in new sectors and how these will be supported. Nigel Dawn.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Can I just simply ask the general question about how people feel that the proposals before us will help new entrants to get in, or whether it won't help new entrants, if we simply work on the basis that we do need younger farmers to come in because we're all getting a year older every year that goes by?
Bill Swee.
The new entrants to farming are clearly very important. The research record on the ability to move young people into farming when the costs of entry are very high is not terribly optimistic. People will stay in farming into their old age if they can derive income from it, and that is the case at the moment. Quite a large part of the costs of entry into farming arises because of the embodied value of CAP subsidies. That's why it's such a high cost to enter into farming. When my grandfather went into farming in the 1920s and 30s, the cost of entry was very low, and a lot of young people entered the industry, and in fact the grandchildren of some of those entrants are still running farming empires in Scotland today. And therefore, to subsidise people into farming is probably going to prove rather expensive. It's rhetorically appealing, but actually all the evidence, and some major research was done in Ireland looking at exactly this problem a few years ago. Peter and I were involved in the study with NFUS and Tenant Farm Forum looking at this a few years back, and it is extremely difficult to design efficient policies to get young people into farming when the costs of entry are very high.
For that, and I don't want to stop others from coming in, but I'm just wondering, can I go back to your first comment, please, Professor Slee, and just say, if older farmers just tend to farm into old age, is there a risk, is this a fact, that perhaps that just means that the farms become less efficient, because as we get older we just become happier with what we've always done? And would it be a fair suggestion that younger farmers are more likely to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of their farm in a way in which their father or grandfather won't, because he's just comfortable doing what he's doing?
I certainly think that well-trained young farmers coming into the industry, bringing new blood and new ideas, would be greatly beneficial. I think the challenge is to grant aid that. In some ways, some of those older farmers who are farming less intensively are probably serendipitously delivering quite high levels of environmental good, or low levels of environmental bad, as they apply less fertilizers and so on. So it's not all a bad thing, and it may be rather expensive to deliver the gains that you're wanting by funding new entrants into the industry.
Thank you. It's maybe worth noting that new entrants aren't necessarily the same thing as young entrants, given the nature of farming. Andrew Midgley.
It's just to flag one point, which is that there's a big package here, and I think we're supportive of what the government's doing. It is trying to do everything it can within its power to help new entrants, and it's important that it's seen as a whole package, so that it's access into Pillar 1 and the support in Pillar 2. And when you put all those together, then it's a useful and important step, and that's a good thing. There was still a wider set of challenges for new entrants accessing the industry, getting over the barriers to entry, not least access to land, which the government doesn't necessarily have the ability to influence very easily. But for what it's setting out to do, I think it needs to be commended.
Okay. James Graham.
I need to make the point that finance is one of the critical issues, I think, here for new entrants. And the changes in the banking system and the way banks operate over the last 5 or even 10 years has actually seen it become more difficult for young farmers to access conventional bank financing. And whereas in the past the flow of money between generations happened through the intermediary of the local bank manager, we know that now is no longer happening. And that is partly why we're engaged in a knowledge transfer partnership to research at the moment whether a new farm-based, farm-owned savings and loan cooperative actually would be feasible and popular in Scotland. And we're just in the process of that now.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you for that. I want to come back to Nigel Dawn, because I think we were given an example last week of a specific issue that new entrants feel that they're having to cope with at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I mean, one of the things that does follow from what was said last week is that farmers were suggesting it was very difficult to actually just rent grassland, particularly over this year and next year, because they felt that the landowner would actually be trying to hold on to it so that he would have entitlement to the cap when the new system comes in. And I'm wondering whether anybody can give me any feedback on whether that's true. And given that we do have to have a reference year for the cap, which year that might sensibly be?
And do you want to come back on? Andrew Midgley.
Yeah, I think that one comes straight to me. When you have a system such as the cap, when you're introducing support, it has an effect on decision making, and people will be making rational decisions from their business point of view. And so everyone will be, when you move to an area-based system, everyone will be trying to try and secure control of land so that it counts in their business. And I think we can't get away from that fact. You know, that's the reality of the system. There are, I think it's important to flag at the same time, wider agendas that are sort of making landowners reluctant to let, and that is the wider agenda around the right to buy, about the agricultural holdings review. And as long as that goes on, you know, it has a consequence on the rest of the industry, and it's highly destructive, and so we need to move past that. Both of these things have an impact. In terms of the year, I think we were at 2013. I think you know, stick with the current proposals. I don't have a particular stance in one way or the other. So.
Just for the purposes of clarity, then you would accept the point that Johnny Hall made last week, that landowning interests are taking land back in hand at the moment and sitting on it to try and draw down payments?
Now,
he was quite specific about that, so it'd just be good to get some clarity on that.
The terms that are used here are quite important. So you said landowning interests.
Mm-hmm.
You know, any owner-occupier farmer is a landowning interest. You know, so it's quite easy for that to be turned round as, oh, this is large landowners who aren't farmers who are trying to get hold of land and then inappropriately access payment. So you know, I wouldn't support that suggestion. You know, people who are farming and who will be eligible for support will be trying to make rational business decisions, and so everyone is trying to access land. Now, that's the nature of the system. I would argue against and suggest that we avoid the sort of characterisation which is, oh, landowners are trying to do X or Y, because that actually simplifies things too much.
Pete Ritchie.
I want to make a wider point about new entrants, simply that Nourish would support more small farms in Scotland. We think we need a more diverse farming sector with more diverse models of farming ownership. We've gone down a road of bigger farms supplying the supermarkets. That's one route to market. But we need a more diverse sector with smaller farms, particularly in peri-urban areas, supplying the cities, and a more diverse range of farming businesses. And like James, I think there are alternative financial models to help get people into farming through either local authority or third sector pension funds. Land's not going anywhere, so it's a reasonably good investment, and we'd like to see more broad-based investment in land and rent that to new tenants and give those tenants a lot of support, both in production skills but also in marketing and cooperation skills.
Final point on this, Vicky Swales.
It's just a very quick point. I think we need to be very careful of anecdote in all of this. There's an awful lot of anecdote flying around. The beef sector is going to be hit. It's going to be a disaster. Farmers are doing this, farmers are doing that. We don't actually know. We're in a huge period of uncertainty, as Andrew said. People are trying to make logical, rational business decisions. They will do that based on the evidence in front of them. But until we pin this down and get some final decisions, it's going to be very difficult to know how people are going to react one way or the other. But we should be very careful about speculation, and we should always try and be as evidence-based as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you for that contribution. Moving on to look at coupled support, Alec Ferguson.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if I could just make the point that I don't even think it will actually be the decisions that determine the outcome all over this. I think it will have people react to those decisions and what their business planning is in relation to those decisions. And we're not going to know that for a couple of years, I suspect, till this is, whatever the new system is bedded in. We've covered a lot of the generalisation of coupled support due to Mr MacDonald's timely intervention earlier on, for which I will thank him later. But I would also make a point that I think Vicky Swales made earlier, I think inadvertently, when I think she suggested that coupled support was in some way throwing a lot of new money into direct subsidy. I would make the point that any coupled payments is not new money. It is, if you like, a redevelopment of the existing Pillar 1 support. So there's no new money that goes into coupled payments. If coupled payments are increased, it will be less money going in some other direction. But I think if you agree, we've covered the generalisations of it. But I wonder if I could just cover, if we accept that coupled payments are going to exist, cover a topic that I did raise last week, which was, Vicky again has just mentioned the fact that the beef sector has always been deemed to be particularly vulnerable to changes in CAP regime, and I don't think anybody is of a different opinion this time around. 8% of coupled support, the Cabinet Secretary has said, will go towards the beef sector. The rationale being to preserve the beef sector at its current levels, if not help to expand the national beef herd. And the point I raised last week was that if you want to do that through a coupled support payment, i.e. the beef calf scheme, is making a relatively large sum to a small number of calves born to any herd, and then reducing those payments, the right way to go about it, because I can't see how that sort of regime is going to encourage anybody to maintain or indeed increase their beef herd, if they're looking at doing so, if the vast majority of the payments are going to the fewest number of calves. And I just wonder if anybody's got any thoughts on that.
Swales.
A couple of thoughts there. I mean, we need to be very careful about the purpose of coupled payments within EU rules. And they're very clear that this is about maintaining production. If it was seen to increase production, then they would have to reduce the payment rates. This is not a panacea to increasing beef production in Scotland. I don't have the wording of the regulations in front of me, but it serves a very specific purpose, and it is to help particular kinds of farming systems or types of farming systems where there are certain particular economic, social or environmental problems. There are some issues, I think, with the current schemes and the use of coupled payments, which, in broad terms, we don't support the idea of coupled payments.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I did say if we accept that they're there anyway.
Absolutely.
For the purpose of this, we have to.
I just wanted to flag up that the analysis that has been done historically, first on the Scottish Beef Calf Scheme, there hasn't been an up-to-date analysis of the Scottish Beef Scheme, but actually it hasn't worked. It hasn't prevented the decline in beef cattle numbers in Scotland, so it's not serving even the purpose which government wanted it to serve. If there were to be coupled payments used, I think we could construct something in a way which was better targeted to supporting the more high nature value farming systems in the north and west of Scotland, which are particularly environmentally important. But overall, I don't think there's a great deal of evidence that actually this is achieving what government wants it to achieve, and it does rather feel like turning the clock back to the old days of production subsidies.
Okay, David McCracken.
To say my SRUC colleagues would support the 8% voluntary couple scheme going to beef farmers, but with the front loading of it being decreased so that the current below the current level, so that a greater range of medium-sized farms would benefit. But unfortunately, they haven't told me what they mean by medium. So, but I'm assuming it's certainly more than it's on the basis of your original question. Can we get actually bigger farms to actually get some advantage from this?
Okay, thank you very much for that. Just to wrap up the discussion on Pillar 1, I think Angus MacDonald has a final question.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I should perhaps have raised this point at the start of the proceedings. So before we do move on to covering the SRDP in more detail, I'd like to raise the Irish Tunnel proposal. There's been some debate in Scotland and elsewhere about the Irish Tunnel model designed to substantially slow the pace of the transfer to area-based farm support payments. Now, clearly, there are a number of disadvantages to that, not least that by 2020, some 20 years after the last reference period, payments would still contain an element of the historic payment system. Now, that can't be good in anybody's book, and I'd be interested to hear the panel's views.
Well, very briefly, can we take some views on that? Pete Ritchie.
I mean, just very briefly, when you try to explain to people in the pub how CAP works, and you say to them, people are getting paid on the basis of a number of sheep they had in 1995, they go, that can't be right. And you say, no, that's right. And people want to keep it going for another 6 years. And they go, is this public money? And you say, yes. And they say, how is that allowed to happen? That's all I want to say.
Just drinking some interesting pubs, if that's the topic of conversation, Mr. Ritchie. Andrew Midgley.
I think Pete is absolutely right. We know we have to move, and we basically have to get on with it. I mean, we can talk about and debate the degree and the pace of transition, but we have to get to the stage where we can break that link.
Is that a generally held view, accepted view? Okay, that's useful, thank you. Let's move on to deal with Pillar 2. Can we look at the SRDP funding, etc.? What measures should be included in the programme? Perhaps those that maybe have some ideas that aren't there. Let's just get a general feel for the views on Pillar 2. David McCracken.
It's not an easy question to answer, because we are where we are with regard to the level of funding that's available within Pillar 2. And we clearly need from, there's a whole host of things within Pillar 2, but certainly from an agri-environment perspective, there's a clear need to be more targeted within that. And that, from an agri-environment perspective, that how we go about doing the targeting, I know I'm involved, Vicky's involved, there's a lot of work ongoing within Scottish Government at the minute to actually try and establish how best can we actually target measures to where they would make best effect. But as we said in a meeting, yes, I think it was only Monday, you know, we're not yet at the stage of knowing how to do that, or how best to do that, or what the implications that would be for the actual funding. And there was some discussion that, you know, while we have a range of potential measures available to us, we may actually get to the stage, if we are wanting to make the best impact with measures we have, we may actually have to reduce the level of measures that we actually try and actually implement. And that opens up another debate in terms of how do we go about doing that. And so from an agri-environment perspective, one view has been put forward, we focus in on those measures where Scotland and Scottish Government have a statutory remit again, so measures that are helping us actually meet our water framework directives or our statutory Natura directives. And that is one view, but again, I don't have an answer, but I would suggest that having gone through a process of revising our Scottish biodiversity strategy and having targets for our 2020 to achieve that, we won't achieve the full range of what we're trying to achieve in that strategy if we only focus on water framework and Natura objectives.
Swales.
It's quite clear, as David suggested, we have a limited budget and we're going to have to cut our cloth according to our means. So we could do very many great things with Pillar 2, but we will have to be realistic, and that's exactly why we have engaged in the process of talking about targeting a more effective use of the money that we've got. Scottish Environment Link's priorities for funding are the Agri-Environment Climate Measure, the forestry grants, advice and knowledge transfer linked to that, the collaboration fund, and LEADER, which takes a small amount of money but can serve a valuable purpose. Those are our top-line priorities for expenditure. We have very serious concerns about LFAS as the scheme currently stands and the allocation of almost 35% of the budget to that. That's not because we don't think there's a need to help, as we discussed earlier, some of those economically disadvantaged farmers, but what we could do is get that right in Pillar 1. So basically we could get Pillar 1 right in terms of the redistribution of support and actually either reduce or even not have an LFAS measure in Pillar 2, which would free up £65 million per annum to spend on a whole range of other things, which would be extremely helpful, not just to the environment, but to the farming community and to rural areas as a whole. Overall, we think the balance of the programme should be on delivering public benefit, not private benefit. There are elements within the programme which, to some extent, deliver a bit of both or are more on the private benefit side of things. So they help businesses develop, diversify their income, etc. But the benefit of that comes back directly to the business. Now, we need to use that public money very carefully in those situations. It may be appropriate to pump prime certain activities or to get them going, but we shouldn't certainly see them as long-term subsidy in that regard. And we certainly reject the NFUS suggestion that Pillar 2 money should be used to help those most affected by the impacts of Pillar 1. Let's be clear about the objectives for this programme and what we're trying to achieve. It's not just some solution to some problems that were created by the move to regionalised payments.
We'll come on and deal specifically about the appropriateness of the allocations for the proposed measures, but let's sort of deal with the general situation in a moment in terms of what measures should be in there. Andrew Midgley.
Thank you. I would, if you just look at the content of the proposed SRDP, there are lots of good things in there, but the allocation of the budgets has a big issue around it, and it looks, to be frank, like it's a status quo SRDP. It's about maintaining the current activity. It's an extension of the previous one with a bit of modification in terms of process to try and make things easier. But what's lacking is a real idea of what we're trying to achieve at the end of it. It's treading water effectively, and that's slightly disappointing. Having said that, we are in a difficult place in terms of changes in Pillar 1, and we do have to be slightly cautious. But so it's a slightly complicated message. So overall, it's slightly disappointing because it's treading water. So what will be different? If we're thinking about long-term, about enhancing delivery of public good, if we're thinking long-term about the decline of direct support, then we need to be thinking, what are our rural areas like? What is the role of farming in them? How can we support farming businesses to change, to adapt to that new situation? But also, what other things can we support in rural areas to help rural communities develop, to help the rural economy, to help rural businesses? And we need a real forward look there to identify the sorts of rural areas we want. And actually, that's not really what's in there. So I think I'd put in support for change for farming businesses and then wider support for communities and rural businesses.
Professor Slee.
Yes, I think it's worth looking back to the new Rural Development Regulation that came out just before Christmas last year. And it talks about fostering knowledge transfer and innovation, enhancing competitiveness, promoting food chain organisation and risk management, restoring, preserving and enhancing ecosystems, promoting resource efficiency and transition to a low-carbon economy, and then promoting social inclusion, poverty reduction and economic development in rural areas. And if you hold those objectives up against what we've got, I think it is, as Andrew says, more of the same. And it's almost as though the Pillar 2 hasn't adapted to those new European imperatives, which I think are perfectly reasonable. And I certainly would go along with Vicky and say that if I look down the list, KTE, Agri, Environment and Climate, but with a significantly greater emphasis on climate, I would argue. Leader, cooperation, I would add as well to that. Forestry, and indeed business development, where it is engendering transformational change, are reasonable components of that programme.
Stuart. Goodall.
Unsurprisingly, I'd focus in on forestry. The way I look at it is that a lot of the things that we've been discussing this morning about multi-purpose land use, about achieving benefits both in terms of production but the environment and hitting carbon targets, are all things that we can deliver through forestry. And the other thing I would particularly highlight is the frustration that often forestry is seen as an alternative to farming, that somehow there should be a conflict there and one should happen at the expense of the other. Whereas we talk to an awful lot of farmers, and we've got members who both farm land and have forestry, and they can see how integration of those two actually benefits the farming side. So I think it's certainly not a zero-sum game in the way it's often presented, which is quite disappointing. And also speaking to farmers in the Northwest, there's interest there in terms of how forestry can encourage people back onto the land as a way of giving them an immediate income, providing that improvement to production, but also providing a capital resource which will give them value for the future. And the kind of forestry we're talking about are not the forests that are often thrown back at the sector, which took place in the mid-20th century. The forests that we plant now are designed to fit into the landscape. They're designed to account for biodiversity. They're there for people. We work with local communities in this planting. So it really is an opportunity for a win-win, and we see that as very positive. And the last point I would make is that, unfortunately, the forestry component of SRDP is, at the moment, being seen as a bit of a bucket for anything which is related to forestry. So, principally, it was set up to deliver some core objectives. Now, anything which might involve a tree is being thrown into that, so let's fund out of that pot. And if government's going to achieve its objectives, it was already insufficient for those core objectives. To throw in more just means that it's becoming more and more unachievable.
Okay, David McCracken.
Just to have on record, I mean, SRUC does support the continuation of ELFAS in its current form, particularly to help actually buffer the impacts that changes in Pillar 1 will be actually having on farm businesses, and recognising that Less Favoured Area Support Scheme is important for a range of farm businesses out there. Having said that, though, we would also look to the introduction of the area natural constraints in 2018, and if the introduction of that helps identify a greater range of grazing qualities within Pillar 1, then we would recognise there's a potential opportunity there to actually rebalance the amount of ELFAS funding and put more of that support within Pillar 1, but that depends on the development of the ENC process.
Your Cook.
So I think the points have just been made. There's a lot of very good measures been chosen, and the structure is, is no surprise given, the budget constraints and carbon targets and so on. But as Bill and Andrew have said, it's a rural development programme, so where's the development? That's a bit that kind of stood out to me. I didn't feel there was anything about transformation in it. As we said in our opening statements, as I said, what we're aiming for is an industry that can stand on its own feet to a greater extent in the future. So the transformational change stuff, I just feel doesn't have a high enough investment. I think a lot of folk would say that. That doesn't mean some huge capital investment scheme and heaps of sheds going up again, but it means, a targeted transformational change investment thing would have been good.
Challenging given the budget. James Graham.
Yeah, just three small points. The first one is to particularly say something for the food and drink business support. Just want to emphasise the criticality of that for our food processing sector, which has been under a great deal of pressure the last few years. We are in competition to have processing facilities in Scotland, so that is critically important. The other point was just to support the proposals for cooperative action, that scheme. I would say that the name given to that scheme has caused some confusion within the cooperative business sector, who see cooperatives as a business entity rather than a collaboration amongst a very wide range of stakeholders. And there are some who are mistaking what that is about, that one. The other point just to make was on the Knowledge Transfer and Innovation Fund. I was surprised the budget wasn't higher for that, because if there's one thing we need to do, it's to initiate, to stimulate, to support, to encourage more innovation. And that really seems to be the fund that has that purpose.
Vicky Swales.
It was just to come back on a couple of points, and particularly on the LFAS one, and why we see it as problematic, partly because it takes such a large share of the budget, and therefore it means less money for things like knowledge transfer and cooperation and advice and the things that really help. But also because of the way the scheme's constructed. I don't know whether members of this committee have ever delved into LFAS and looked at the scheme itself in any detail, but it's a big, big problem. We talked earlier about breaking the link to historic production. Well, LFAS embeds that link to historic production because it has a very complicated setup which relates to grazing categories and production in the past. So although the scheme has been rebased on livestock figures in 2009, it still effectively targets the money where production was greatest within the LFA historically. The intention of that measure is to give the money, the compensation, to the farmers in the most disadvantaged areas where production is more difficult and where they weren't able to have a higher agricultural output. So it's actually a reverse of what it should be. And we're now going to have to sit with that until we move to the ANC scheme, the new designation, and then potentially a new scheme within that for the next 4 years or more. So that's the big problem. It's not actually helping the farmers. It's intended to help. It's simply skewing the money more to the more productive parts of the LFA, as it's always done, but historically.
Yeah, just to highlight that both land use strategy pilots, both the Scottish Borders one and the Aberdeenshire one, are developing map-based decision support tools which could help inform the targeting that's being discussed. And furthermore, that they are being developed in consultation with local stakeholders as well. So there's very much a local and regional input. So they can help land managers and communities come to decisions where the balance of services, as we've heard about food production, forestry, wildlife benefits, flood protection, can be assessed. And the local priorities are very much informed by what people see as the local benefits that can arise. And in order to deliver this, then it's taking a catchment-based approach. And we're learning from, but building upon our experiences in our region. In fact, the consultation on the SRDP mentions the Tweed Forum and the collaborative work, the cooperation work that they've developed for things like natural flood management. And we think that the platform will be in place with those two pilots to help inform the implementation of the next SRDP.
Finally, on this point, Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Just picking up on the LFAS debate. I'm not quite sure what the criteria is for qualifying for LFAS, but is there an argument to suggest that either LFAS or the ANC should be targeted at smaller farms and crofts?
Professor Slee.
I share the reservations of Vicky about LFAS as it stands. It's a very blunt instrument of policy to deliver environmental gain, and actually a very blunt instrument to deliver social support, which is how it's been argued often, or for both those criteria. If it were to be more targeted to smaller farmers, at least you could argue that it might deliver that social purpose. As it stands, though, I think it's an extremely blunt instrument to do what it does, and it soaks up a disproportionate share of the total Pillar 2 package.
Okay. Andrew?
Initial response is that the change to ANC will probably, or will be intended to flip the issue that Vicky raised about the most of the money now going to the better land. So the money will be redistributed towards the poorer land and the more peripheral areas, and so that may in effect deliver what you want to see without necessarily having to discriminate in terms of size.
Pete Ritchie, briefly.
Just echo the points people have made about we've got to have a purpose to this use of this relatively small amount of money, and it's got to be focused. And we do have to make sure that all the bits are lined up around low carbon, about resource use efficiency, about enhancing natural capital, and in Nourish's book about connecting people to the source of their food more closely. And I think, in the earlier scheme, it wasn't clear that those bits were lined up. There wasn't a common ethos. So the way that applications are assessed is going to be hugely important, the way the advisory service and knowledge transfer service works, so that they're all heading in the same direction, and there's a clear message about the direction of travel seems really important. So as one small thing, Nourish has proposed that if you want to get money out of the SRDP as a farmer, you're going to have a resource use audit and a carbon audit on your farm as a condition of that.
Thank you for that. And talking about money, I think we need to look at the distribution of funds. Cara Hilton.
Yeah, looking at how the funds are divided between the measures within Pillar 2, what are the panel's general views on how the funds should be divided? Vicky Swales has already talked about LFAS, and I am particularly interested in people's views on the support levels for this scheme. I mean, more than a third of the Pillar 2 budget is allocated to this scheme, yet organisations like the RSPB argue that it doesn't represent best value for public money and provides very few environmental benefits. Should there not be more investment in schemes like LEADER that provide clear value for public money and more environmental benefits?
Thank you for that. Who has a view on this? I'm sure there will be many views. Or perhaps not. Professor Slee.
Yeah, I think I've made the point already that I think LFAS has a disproportionately large share. It's not transformative or transformational in what it's doing. It's maintaining the status quo, and it doesn't even deliver those elements of social good or environmental benefit that we'd be looking for. I would certainly be happy to see leaders' funding enhanced. I'd be happy to see collaboration enhanced. I think we haven't mentioned a lot forestry because it's largely a agricultural audience around the table. But there is no doubt that in terms of climate change, forestry is the most efficient way of sequestering additional carbon. We shouldn't do it, of course, on high carbon soils, and we don't want to dry out peat reserves, but that's already factored into the equation. So we should be focusing it where we know we can, if you like, get a social, economic or environmental payback. And I just don't think the new scheme offers enough in that direction.
It's worth pointing out that the audience today is really the committee who's listening to the views of the panel, and I think the committee would take a much broader view than simply agriculture in this regard. On which note, Stuart Goodall.
I mean, I could just simply say I agree with Professor Bill Slee. I think basically LFAS is Pillar 1 in disguise, and it's disappointing. It's not delivering the principles of SRDP, and it's crowding out opportunities like the forestry sector, which I think can deliver far more and allow farmers to look at diversification and actually for Scotland to deliver some of its serious targets, like the carbon target, which is going to be very difficult to deliver. So, I agree with everything you've said.
Andrew Midgley.
Thank you. While I said earlier, this looks disappointing treading water type thing, I did introduce the caveat there that we've got all this change in Pillar 1. And for us, for Scottish Land and Estates, we are trying to find the pragmatic stance here. ELFAS is obviously the one place where there is potential to move money to fund other things. And I think we would like to find the balance between trying to ensure a degree of stability, and that's what ELFAS would potentially deliver in terms of everything else changing in Pillar 1. ELFAS could deliver a certain element of stability for those people going through that change. So what we need to, we think that what you need to do is potentially maintain the majority of that in the short term whilst that change is going on. Think about it and reassess it quickly as soon as we've got a better picture as to what that change will involve. But even in the short term, a small amount of wiggle room where the vast majority of that stability is maintained, there could still be some funds released to other areas of the programme that would help in terms of delivering the wider agenda.
Can I bring in Claudia Beamish here? Claudia wanted to make a point.
Right, thank you, Convener. I just wanted to throw into this discussion the questions that have been raised by some groups, such as Scottish Wildlife Trust, that I put it as a question. Is the Agri-Environment and Climate Change Fund within SRDP large enough? And I think RSPB have also highlighted that they don't think it is large enough. And also, from my own perspective, I'd be interested to know whether the new cooperation fund or cooperative fund or whatever it's going to be called with an amount of 10 million, if that really is enough in terms of the stated aims of SRDP to actually for groups and partners and public bodies and farmers to collaborate in this scheme.
Davy McCracken.
Yes, just to reiterate what we said earlier, I mean, although I made SRUC's position on ELFAS clear, then throughout the other aspects of the SRDP, the agri-environment included, we recognise that the sort of funds are not necessarily sufficient there to actually do the bulk of what's achieved, which is why I mentioned earlier with agri-environment, some hard choices are going to have to be made as to what we could fund. But the same argument applies to we recognise and welcome and accept the need for a greater advisory service, as everybody does, but is sufficient funding there? We recognise the value of extending out support to small farms, but again, we have a question, is there sufficient funding there, and what will be the impact of opening that up? So there are a number, if not all, areas within the current SRDP where funding is a major issue.
Okay. Vicky Swales.
Thank you for the questions. I've had a good go at ELFAS already, so I won't say any more about that, but it would be remiss of me if I didn't make the point that Scottish Environment Link has called for, at the very least, a minimum spend of 60 million per annum for the agri-environment climate measure. Now, that's been very pragmatic, because actually the fund that's needed to meet our biodiversity, climate change and water quality targets is somewhere more likely in the region of 400 million per annum. We are a long, long way from making the kind of investments we need to meet our environmental targets, but any small increase would be very much welcome. The current budget, the current amount that's proposed, 355 million, which I think is about 48 million per annum, of that, about 38 million is funding ongoing commitments. That means you have roughly around 10 million per annum new money to do new things, to do extra climate change work, to do extra work to meet water quality targets or to meet biodiversity. It's a pittance, it's nowhere near enough, and we really need to find a way to increase that.
Fund that from taking money away from ELFAS?
I think we would. I mean, it's very difficult to see where the money could come from, because once you get past the headlines of LFAS, agri-environment and forestry, and we support money going into forestry, you're down into talking about funds which are 10, 20 million. So it is the big ticket item that's soaking up, 35% of that budget. I would like to be clear that we very much support the Cooperative Action Fund. I don't think that is enough money, Claudia. I think we could quite easily double that and still spend it very easily. We can see lots of ways amongst the linked partnership in which that money could be used really well, putting in a facilitator, bringing groups of farmers to work together to meet water quality objectives or to meet biodiversity targets and other things, and getting landscape scale restoration and land management to really good effect, also for climate change outcomes as well. And also advice, we would support increasing the budget. We're concerned that 20 million again isn't enough. We called for quite an expansion in advisory services. We really need to help farmers make the change. There's huge amounts of knowledge out there, knowledge transfer is the other one, to get this stuff through to people and to help them along the process. We're just not making the investments we need to. But agri-environment definitely needs to increase.
Thank you. Alex Ferguson, do you want to make a point?
No.
Oh, sorry, my mistake. Bill Slee.
2 points I'd like to make. One is to support Vicky and say that cooperation and collaborative action at landscape scale offers, I think, enormous scope for improving water quality, increasing habitat connectivity. But I'd go back to some of Andy Tharm's points earlier and bring in this concept of ecosystem services. And if we're clever about how we design schemes, we can actually stack the benefits of different ecosystem services, of flood control, biodiversity management, landscape enhancement, recreational access, and so on. And I'd like to point out to the committee that in Wales, very similar in terms of its livestock emphasis, they have done away with LFA scheme in Wales and replaced it with a more elaborate ecological, climate change, land management scheme that will take that money and I think use it much more effectively.
Angus MacDonald's got a point he wants to raise in relation to this.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. If I could bring the panel's attention to the Crofton Counties Agricultural Grants Scheme. We heard last week that both the Scottish Crofton Federation and the NFUS are concerned about the new Crofton and Small Farm Support Scheme, potentially being opened up to all 34,000 units in Scotland between 3 and 50 hectares. However, when the NFUS were here last week, they confirmed with us that while they would like to see the scheme opened up to small farms, they clarified that these should only be in the Crofton counties. Now, we also heard that there are issues currently, and Orkney was mentioned, with regard to farms sitting side by side to crofts and farmers being unable to tap into the scheme. So I'd be interested to hear how the panel members feel about that and how they would like to see the proposal progress. In particular, should the scheme be rolled out to all farms under 50 hectares?
Davy McCracken.
The SRUC is supportive of the general principle of actually bringing small farms more into that scheme. We wouldn't necessarily sort of limit it to within the Crofton counties, but we would have queries and issues about the eligibility. We would want to actually see an active farming element within the eligibility criteria, and we think the up to 50 hectares is too blunt a measure. We would rather see some measure within the eligibility that's based on remoteness or access to markets to actually provide, as we were talking earlier on, what is the real justification for opening up the support to those small farmers.
Andrew Midgley.
Thank you. If I could just return to the collaboration and come to the crofting, I just wanted to signal our support on the cooperative action. The question about whether or not 10 million is enough is actually, it's difficult to answer. It's a very positive initiative, but most of the money that would be spent from the initiatives would be drawn from the other budget. So if it's a cooperative action to deliver agri-environment benefit, then the agri-environment budget would cover most of that. So the 10 million then becomes about funding the facilitation role or the role of getting the people who want to work together to be able to work together, or helping them to do so. And so the question then comes, if it turns out not to be enough, can we change things so that we can continue to fund it? And I think we need to try and ensure that we have the flexibility to move money around budget headings if at all possible, because some things are popular and delivering good things, then we shouldn't necessarily close the door on them because we've made a particular point at the beginning to say it's just this much. On the crofting scheme and small farms, we as an organisation support the widening to small farms as well, but again picked up on this issue about the sort of potential for like economic status. The intention was to support a particular sort of activity, and it's how we capture that. And again, the bluntness of the 3 to 50 hectare wouldn't necessarily enable you to make a justification. You could have some very intensive small holders, if you like, that might not necessarily be your target audience.
Okay, thank you for that. And Pete Ritchie.
Yes, Nourish very much supports the Cooperative Action Fund, and we'd like to see that being used to stimulate short supply chains and collaboration between producers and consumers, which is an element which has cropped up in quite a lot of the EU conversations, but hasn't been translated into our rural development programme. So we're very keen to see local food economies supported through the cooperation thing leading to that. And it is hard to see, once you've done the cooperation, where the money for some of those things will come from, because it's starting to get so tight in the other schemes. And finally, on the small farmers thing, Nourish supports that extension to small farms. But again, it's got to be about what's this development going to deliver in terms of carbon reduction, in terms of resource use efficiency, in terms of local jobs, in terms of local food, not I want a shed.
Before we wrap this section up, can I just raise a point with Stuart Goodall? In the written evidence that was provided to the committee, I think there's a reference to the land which the overwhelming majority of new woodland planting would take place upon can hardly be described as fertile for agriculture. I think the suggestion is the overwhelming majority would be in a different category. But there have been examples, have there not, in recent years where prime agricultural land has been purchased for the purpose of tree planting, and there were concerns raised last week about that. Could you shed a little bit of light on the balance that's struck there?
Certainly. I mean, in terms of the purchases that have been made, they've principally been made by the Forestry Commission on behalf of the Scottish Government as part of its own repositioning programme. What we're focusing on in terms of achieving that 10,000 hectare target each year for 10 years is what Scottish Government has signed up to, in which actually the farming unions plus a number of people around this table signed up to as well. Is overwhelmingly not about prime agricultural land. I mean, what planting is taking place, which is those purchases, can be measured in tens of hectares, so it's very small. And just a couple of quick points. In terms of, well, one of the bits of evidence that we got within that Woodland Expansion Advisory Group was that in a worst case scenario, and I underline the word worst case scenario, achieving 100,000 hectares would reduce agriculture production by at most 2%. And I would argue that that doesn't take into account all those points about how if you integrate farming and forestry rather than displacement, which is what it's looking at, you wouldn't see that reduction. And one last point, it was interesting just getting some figures from my colleague who knows a lot more about this. If we look at historically when forestry increased from about 8% land cover to 15% land cover in the mid-20th century, so huge expansion, during that period, sheep numbers increased. So I think it's very difficult to imply that, as I was saying earlier on, there's this zero-sum game. We're not focused on prime agricultural land, and we feel that an expansion of forestry would have minimal impacts on agriculture, and done sensibly through looking at things like LFAS and making it available to integrate with forestry rather than pushing out forestry and crowding it out, we could get a win-win scenario which we're currently missing.
Jim Hume.
Just on that point, and Stuart and I have talked about this before, but I just want him to point out the realisation that it's difficult for the majority of tenant farmers, of course, to invest in forestry. I'd just like Stuart maybe to consider that point, because obviously the tenant sector is a large part of Scotland.
Absolutely, and I think it's an important point. We have had many discussions over the years with the Tenant Farmers Association, and there's a lot of sympathy and support for the opportunity to plant trees again, because people can see that it can be a beneficial land use for them. But it's about how do you come up with an agreement with your landlord which caters for the issues around, the value, certainly the future value of the trees that you're planting. And one thing that we've been encouraging, although for an organisation ourselves we're so small it's difficult to actually undertake that work ourselves, is how you come up with some sort of model agreements and things like that. But it's certainly something I think if we could make progress on, it would be beneficial for both sides.
And maybe we should have a word with Andrew Major at some point, but could it not be seen as a tenant's improvement? Therefore, if the tenant doesn't stay for a long time, because a tree's got a 40-year life, they could get some value at their way-go.
Swales wanted to come in on this as well.
Just a quick point out, I was also a member of the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, and it's the point that there shouldn't automatically be a presumption against planting on prime agricultural land of trees. In some situations, there's very good reasons for doing so. Riparian planting, which can help manage water and flood risk management, reduce diffuse pollution, for example. Much of our prime agricultural land is also the land which is closest to centres of population. There are access and recreation reasons why people like to go out into woodland. So I don't think we should have a blanket prescription against planting on prime agricultural land, which I think there's sometimes a bit of an assumption that we should.
Thank you for that contribution. Moving on to look at the application process and the assessment of applications. Alex Ferguson.
Well, thank you, Convener. And I don't know what anybody else has picked up over the last two sessions, but I think one thing that's coming clear to me is I'm not sure there could ever be enough money in Pillar 2 or CAP to satisfy all the demands that are going to be made of it, because the truth is we've got less money to be spread over a wider area of demand, and that's not an easy one for anybody to grapple with. But what you have done is given us a huge number of questions to put to the Minister when he comes in front of us in a couple of weeks' time. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the ultimate package, there is going to be a process of application and delivery of the available funding. And one of the, you'll all be aware that the proposal at the moment is that applications for grants of under £75,000 should be dealt with locally, and over £75,000 should be dealt with nationally. And we heard evidence last week, particularly from the NFUS, which I think got a bit of sympathy, that this could be made, this could be altered very much for the benefit of the smaller farmers and crofters that we've heard quite a lot about today. And their suggestion was that we should have a first level of entry for grants under £10,000 and then up to £50,000 and then nationally for over £50,000. Without sort of necessarily going into the details of £5,000, £10,000, £15,000 here or there, I just wondered if any panel members wanted to contribute on whether they approved of that idea or not. One of the real criticisms and I think genuine criticisms of the last SRDP was how incredibly difficult it was for smaller businesses, not just farm, smaller rural enterprises and businesses to access. And it seems to me that this proposal might in some way address that. So I'd be interested to hear the views of the panel on that one.
Vicky Swales.
I'll answer this, if I may, wearing an RSPB hat rather than a link hat. I mean, I think we potentially have some sympathy with that view. We have concerns with the 75,000 threshold for a couple of reasons. One, for exactly that, in terms of the history of the last programme, with the problems of smaller farmers getting access, and 75,000 feels quite high, and that we might well have those sorts of problems again. So I think looking at that and with a potential to reduce it would actually be beneficial. We also have concerns from another perspective of that threshold, which is the actual assessment and improvement process, which means that that's all being done at local level by ARPID agriculture officers in the region. Our concern is that we make sure that applications are approved by the most appropriate authority and those with the expertise to do so. Simply fast-tracking everything through an agriculture officer, and I mean no disrespect to those officers on the ground, but they come from a certain background, they have certain knowledge sets. We'd be quite concerned about agri-environment schemes, for example, simply going through that process and SNH not having scrutiny of them. So there's two issues there, but certainly the threshold coming down potentially and maybe banding within that is worth looking at, I think.
Bill Slee.
We evaluated recently the National Rural Network, which supports the delivery of the Rural Development Programme. And in interviewing RPID officers, one of the things that came out was that in the old RPAC committees, which had deliberated in the past, they'd got much closer to the foresters. They'd got much closer to SNH personnel. And actually, at regional level, there was a healthy dialogue that was emerging, and that you had a more comprehensive and better view taken of the land resource and decisions that were made. And I think we've got to be slightly cautious about reducing transaction costs, because if we reduce transaction costs too much, we may reduce the benefits that could potentially arise from the scheme. So I think in principle, having a simplified system for smaller grants might be a good thing. But I share Vicky's concern that I think the benefits that arose from a better understanding amongst local officers operating together might be lost if we have it passing over only one desk in the future.
Yeah, Andrew Midgley.
Thank you. There are different issues here to tease apart, I think. So one is the threshold and the other is the process. So if the suggestion is that underneath a certain threshold, say of £10,000, the process is even simpler, then you know, that potentially gets over one of the barriers. It might be useful to go back to some of the lessons from the current programme. So CAGS, for example, my understanding is that CAGS underspent its budget consistently. And one of the reasons there was the need, it was to do with the intervention rate and the need to secure funding and finance for the rest of the activity that wasn't being funded by government. So there's an issue there about support. It wasn't only about the process or the level of about the administration or the ability to get in. There's a wider set of issues there that even if you have a different process, there is an issue about securing finance to do the rest of the work, to fund it yourself. Another barrier was the process. Now, if you have a threshold of £10,000 and the process isn't different, then you're not helping. So it only works to make an effect if you have a different process. Now, what's not clear in my head is whether or not that's possible. The Scottish Government now have a set of rules about it all being competitive. They would have to ensure that the processes are adhered by so that it's auditable. So I have a question mark in my head, basically, about whether or not there is a real solution there, because there's still going to be a process which requires fairly significant bureaucracy and administration, and that will be a barrier. And there will still be the requirement to part fund the activity yourself. I'm not necessarily against it, and as an organisation I think would probably remain open to it, but I think it was something worth exploring rather than absolutely signing up to.
Aidan McCracken, thank you.
Just to say, I mean, SRUC supported the proposal to actually have a fast track and a more detailed process. We haven't formed any view as to whether it's 75,000 or lower. I would just say, though, with regard to the, you know, it's wider than just the actual application and approval process. Part of what was discussed here has a strong linkage back to the availability to the individual farmers concerned of good local advice to actually put together a good proposal in the first place, and these have to be part and parcel of the thinking of the whole sort of application and approval system.
Okay, thank you. If I may, then we'll move on to look at the issue of the budget allocation decisions. And we've had a very good discussion today about how we might better spend the limited budgets that we have. But I wonder what your views are on the budget allocation decisions made by the UK Government and the Scottish Government regarding transfers between pillars, etc. And do you have any messages to inform the planned review of UK CAP allocations in 2016-17, bearing in mind that we do have the Secretary for State in front of us next week? No, then, right. Andrew Midgley.
I think we would support the rest of the industry in terms of the convergence uplift and the strong messages that could be given to the UK government in terms of the delivering that benefit to Scottish farmers. I think that fundamentally, you know, there's a equality issue there. I recognise Johnny Hall set out some of the complexity around that, but principally, in terms of principle, that should apply, I think.
Is that a generally held view? David McCracken?
Sorry, just to say I agree with what Andrew said, and just to highlight, I mean, for whatever reasons we are where we are, we need to look forward and actually sort of learn the lessons as we go forward and make a better case and have some additional justification for that, and we'd certainly be supportive of that to get a better balance as we discussed earlier on.
Vicky Swales.
There is an argument clearly that that Pillar 1 money should have come to Scotland based on the way in which it's decided what that amount of money is, and the convergence. But clearly you can't stop convergence at the border. If you sign up to the principle of convergence, you also need to sign up to the principle of convergence within Scotland, and that means a redistribution of money far more widely and an evening out of support payments across Europe, between member states and within member states and within regions within member states. That's clearly not what's on the table at the moment, so the Cabinet Secretary might want to bear that in mind in terms of how he chooses his tactics going forward. I mean, the question is obviously if Scotland had got a bigger share of that Pillar 1 budget and had then modulated or made the budget transfer at 15%, that's a much larger amount of money. Now, we haven't made that maximum transfer. If we were to do that in future on a bigger Pillar 1 pot, that would be a good thing for SRDP.
Else? Well, can I thank the panel for their contribution today? It certainly helped inform the deliberations of the committee. It's very much appreciated that you've given your time. I'm going to close the meeting now, move into private. Yeah, I'm going to suspend the meeting now for 5 minutes comfort break, and then we'll reconvene to deal with other business. Thank you.